outside of our group, these rules don't apply. And unfortunately, that's where this country began.
Well, this is uplifting. I hope this is posted up right around the Christmas season,
Right,
just while people are really in a good mood.
Peace and goodwill to all men if you're a man and you look like me and you're white. Otherwise,
bye.
Hey there, if you've joined the podcast today, my name is Chris Jarvis. I work with companies on employee giving and volunteering programs.
And my name's Jake McIsaac. I spend a lot of time thinking about public safety and restorative justice.
So we are having conversations here that we've been having for 20 years.
Yeah, the only difference now is we press record and share it with you.
Thanks for joining us. On today's episode, Jake and I talk about the beginnings of the great American experiment, the democracy in the United States, where it started out of a civil war in England, how it transferred over here, and what the remnants are that we're still dealing with today.
And I'm trying to not step in it as a Canadian talking about U.S. politics and history.
And religion.
Oh, yes. And
that's
religion.
The big one. All right, let's get into it. Hey, Jake, I have a question for you. Just as a Canadian, I'm curious about your perspective.
Okay. So not speaking for all Canadians.
Not speaking for all Canadians.
Okay.
Nope. But I would say you're fairly typical.
Okay.
That's a great compliment.
Yeah. You're average. You're.
How would you describe your friend Jake? Typical.
Yeah.
Okay. The question is, with tens of millions being spent on the American election, how much of it is being followed in Canada? I think some of our listeners would be interested.
So how much is being followed in Canada?
What do you know?
Or am I following? Well, probably lots. So being the average person, maybe it's certainly not the leading story, but it's in the background. I mean, I think most folks would know that midterms are there. They're paying attention to it, trying to see how this will affect decisions south of the border, might affect gas prices and other trade implications. So I think people are paying attention to it in Canada for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So there's sort of a direct connection there. How much of the Christian dominionism or the part of the MAGA movement which wants a Christian nation, like to rewrite legal code based on the Bible or their version of the Bible, how much of that is coming through?
I think we saw some of that. I think there was a trucker freedom rally last year in...
no thinking there. There definitely was. And that was a bit... We even saw that down here.
Yeah. So I think there are... every once in a while, there are these glimpses that show up here in Canada of that. But I don't think it's as mainstream as it might be, or as obvious as it seems to be in the U.S.
All right. Since the next group of senior citizens who are going to be elected to the legislature.
Wait, I just feel like there was a bit... Okay.
So it's typically not... You don't start running when you're a senior, but it's a great retirement plan. You can stay there till you're 80-something.
Well, you can hang on to power, right? I mean,
you can hang on to power, yeah. That's really what's going on.
From what it appears to be, it's not super accessible for folks who are younger or of diverse backgrounds to become part of that political machine, whether they wanted to or not. I just don't know how you would get in. How do you get into that?
You say crazy extreme things, apparently. So there are a number of younger folks who are running on this Christian dominionism.
Explain Christian dominionism a little bit, because I know what you're talking about, but in case folks haven't bumped around and this is a new term.
Looked it up. Afghanistan and Iran are great examples of countries that are ruled by religion, right? Saudi Arabia is another one.
So theocracies in some variety. Okay,
yeah,
got it.
So there's a religion chosen by a small group that is now considered the religion of the land, and their version of it is imposed on everybody. And I think that's really important to note.
So that it affects the rule of law comes directly from religious traditions and incorporates sort of every part of religious life and public life. Okay, they bleed together.
All the same.
Yep. Right. So we see some of that even in the recent demonstrations about a hijab not being worn properly by a young student in Iran and resulting in her death, and then people uprising. Okay, so got it. Caught up.
Christian theocracy, Christian dominionism. The Christian right is a larger group, not
Okay.
all people in the Christian right, which is a sort of an extreme version of Christianity, but not all are. So I just want to make that distinction first before we go into it a bit more here.
So if one of our listeners were like, okay, what are some of the how do I know if my neighbor's a Christian right? How do I what am I looking for? What are some of the tells?
Yeah.
What would that look
Okay.
like?
Well, here's the thing. They have a strong opinion about how everybody else is living. And that comes from the fact that they believe that there's a supernatural entity
Mhm.
living somewhere in reality that cares very much about each individual's behavior. And so their job is to make sure that all humans conform to this entity's preferences,
Okay.
right?
So
Okay.
and there's a prescribed way of living, and
Yeah.
so they're concerned, but there's a bit of a proselytizing effect, right? Sometimes like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
you've
Yeah.
got to join us, be with us. The world is divided into
Hmm.
us and not us, Christians or non-Christian. Okay, okay, is that kind of tracking along where you're
Yeah,
going?
it is. And
Okay,
so in the United States from the very beginning, there have been people who believe this. In fact, several of the colonies were technically theocracies because they derived all of their authority from this entity, which in
right.
this case was the Christian God. And I keep saying entity because I want people to understand this is not an American thing and this is not a
Mhm.
Christian thing. This is
Right.
a Homo sapien default, where when we can't explain things, we have throughout evolution defaulted to caused by fill in the blank, right? And so what we're talking about here is playing out in Iran, or has played out a version of it. It did play out in other countries that were secular and became highly religious over time, or vice versa, which Iran is trying to move away from it.
I just want to be clear, we're not being too critical of people who hold spiritual beliefs or hold these kind of
No,
beliefs that are,
I could,
because
doesn't matter.
I wonder if, because I've seen a different shift here in recent years, particularly lots of the meetings that I've been going to, conferences, larger events often start with a land acknowledgement. Sometimes an elder
Yeah.
will come, an indigenous elder or leader will come and offer a not just a greeting, but a prayer to the Creator. And so, in some ways, it's kind of that's a new thing, or it's newish. It feels new, like it feels like every kind of government type event I'm going to has this kind of beginning and opening.
When you start experiencing it for the first time, yeah, it's kind of interesting. Australia and New Zealand have been doing it for decades.
Right. So, are we saying that that's wrong, or like what are you kind of? Is there no
No,
space for those kind of things in
no,
government?
I could care less which religion we're talking about here. There's just a
Okay.
couple things that I wanted to make a point of in this
Okay.
conversation. One is that there's a retelling of history being played out in politics and in churches today that is sort of like a map without
Mm.
North America on it. So before North America was quote unquote discovered, there was a functional map for everybody to get wherever they needed to go. Most of the time, it worked pretty well. Nobody knew we're missing some stuff. And so,
Mhm.
what we're talking about is a way of seeing the world and saying it's this, this, and this, and appeal to historical facts. And all I want to do in this episode is sort of introduce a few more pieces of information. So, when people hear their ministers at like this St. Louis pastor, this guy's like, 8,000 people in his church, and they're taking on progressive culture. They're taking
Oh,
it on
yes, I
because it's
remember
from
you sent this.
Satan.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
This is important because this kind of thinking is being parroted by several politicians who
right.
don't take the time to really read through things. And they come off saying things like, historically, this separation of church and state, that's not, our founding fathers never believed in this. They wanted it to be a Christian country.
Right,
So all I want to do is introduce some for our listeners, who I'm sure are the choir, but maybe it provides a little bit more information. So when we're out there talking and we hear a candidate on the MAGA side and they say these things, you'll know, well, they left out these parts. They
right.
left out a big chunk of information. So they may be able to navigate that conversation and get where they need to go, but they're omitting huge parts of human history. And that's going to lead somewhere. So this article, I'll just read a couple quotes here. Quote, but then the shutdowns wanted to continue, and then there were the debates, and then George Floyd happened, and then this rush of social justice pressure,
and you couldn't put your finger on it, but something didn't smell right.
End quote. What I think is interesting here, I'm jumping in, is what he thought didn't smell right after mentioning George Floyd. But anyways,
And
Ron is the founding pastor who founded like the 80s or something, the church, this mega church.
And Ron just really began to lean in, and the Lord met him and really gave him a heads up that there was basically a snake in the henhouse as it relates to false teachings of social justice and critical theory and Marxism.
Now, I feel like the Marxism part was a little cheap throwaway there, like the boogeyman, like Napoleon was for the English. When they said, get their kids asleep at night, they'd say the boogeyman or Napoleon's going to come and get you. That like Marxism, poor Marx, the guy. Okay. Right. So then I'm going to skip ahead here. And this is the other part, because I think we have to go back to the foundation of the United States. This is the first parts on the map that we're going to start to fill in for people. Okay.
Our founders knew that this unique republic would only work if there was a morality, specifically a kind of God-centered morality. That's the only way it would work. And the role of the church and the founding fathers in the early days of America, the church is where we discuss civic engagement and policy and politics. And then somewhere along the line, the church drank the Kool-Aid that we weren't to be political. And that separation of church and state and that whole idea has been so confused.
So I want to unravel it a little tiny bit from a non-Christian perspective, but also not an anti-Christian perspective. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly.
All right. So we're going to do a test. I'm a Canadian living in the United States. I love history. Jake is a Canadian living in Halifax, Nova Scotia, the far east of Canada.
Okay. Sure.
It is on the far east. Yeah.
That's a weird way to say that. Go ahead.
You drive into the Atlantic from where you live. That's all I mean, right? Like in Baltimore, I have to go 2 hours before I even hit the Atlantic. So the original founding fathers, these were the guys who signed the Declaration of Independence, and a few of them were writing these Federalist Papers. But one of the things that people don't know among those founding fathers is that is the original, like where the ideas came from that this group of dudes could build on to justify stealing North America from Britain, which is basically what it was.
Stealing, yes.
Okay. As Marx is to communism, so blank is to American independence. As Marx is to communism, so blank is to American independence.
I don't know.
All right. The answer we were looking for is John Locke. John Locke. And in fact, today, in a lot of classes on plagiarism, a very common exercise is to look at Thomas Jefferson's work and John Locke's work and prove that it was not plagiarized. Prove it. Right? Yeah, okay. I mean, it is that universally. Yeah. Okay. So John Locke was a thinker out of England who was incredibly prominent. He wrote a lot of books, a lot of things. In fact, his most famous work is called The Second Treatise of Government, written in 1689 during England's Glorious Revolution. And England's Glorious Revolution was the overthrow of the monarchy of James II, who was sort of he wanted to return to absolute rule. They overthrew him and made him more subservient to Parliament. Okay. And so all of this is written out by John Locke. And in that, he, notches out things like the first principles, which is in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, unalienable rights, social compact between those who govern and the governed, limited government. I mean, this guy fought for limited government, all of that. And this ended up in the Constitution. And that Jefferson penned it like in between work over a 2-day period. So the guy was leaning very heavily on the best thinkers in the world. So as Marx is to communism, so John Locke is to Americanism, I would say.
So John Locke taking a very human-centered approach, right?
Yeah, he was a deist. Yeah.
To those inalienable rights.
Yeah.
What were they?
Okay. The inalienable rights are, in Locke's mind, were life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Like
happiness.
Property.
No.
Jefferson
that comes
changed
later.
It. Jefferson changed it. Okay, and that's really interesting. So property in Locke's mind was whatever you owned, including your own body. The government, in terms of limited government, had no right Over your own body to tell you what to do? Over your own property? Infringed on the rights of others? Number
Unless you
one.
were non-white.
Okay, we'll get there. Unless you
Okay.
infringed on the rights of others. You gave up your life if you killed another person.
Mm-hmm.
You gave up your liberty if you stole from others.
Right.
And you gave up the right to your property when you killed another person. Like, there's very few reasons why the government would ever step in. And the only reason was if you infringed on the rights of others. Now,
this is interesting, right? Because what you actually need in order to live into that vision is you need a system to protect and to do that. So you're starting to tease out the early beginnings of what a justice system is supposed to do, or a system of policing is to protect those property, right? So then property laws and the status quo, or the order to protect those people who were property owners.
Yes. So Jefferson was pitched by a small group of Baptists who said, hey, man, the United States Bill of Rights, what if we made it all come from God? What if we put our authority under God? What if we, just put God more in things? Okay. Mm-hmm. And that's an oversimplification. But Jefferson was, in responding to them, they wanted a national church. And Jefferson's like, guys, we just came from that in England. We don't need that. And the reason he was so against a national church was because in the United States, Christians were killing Christians. They were hanging each other. The Puritans had become this other group, and they did not like the Quakers or the Anabaptists, and nobody likes the Catholics, and they were just keeping them, they were oppressing each other. So Jefferson's like, religion is not going to happen, because we don't want people who believe in anything to fear government interference. So the Bill of Rights, adopted in 1791 as 10 amendments to the Constitution, was one of the earliest political expressions of religious freedom on purpose. Because while their conversations about politics were happening in churches, they were hanging dissenters in trees, not thousands, but dozens, all up and down, right? And this was protected under law by doing this because of the religious aspects of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the danger of when we get thinking that is not diverse enough, when we don't have enough access to varying perspectives, then they must fiercely protect that by othering and dehumanizing folks. So murder is bad, right? You just said that, except when it's someone who's a threat to our way of life.
Yep.
Now we sort of have to give ourselves license that the reason we're taking this life is to protect the order that's around us. So lynching in all of its forms then starts to make sense as to why people were so quick to be able to dehumanize the other. And to your point, which I think starts to make sense in this context right now, it's not all Christians. So who's going to be left out in this new US when all of these things come together and there's a Christian dominion and everything's under the rule of a particular interpretation of the Bible? Who's left out, and what will be required to make that happen?
Well, let's ask them. Let's ask George Grant, who is one of the most prominent figures in the Christian Reconstructionist movement in the United States. Here's what he said in his book, 1987 book, The Changing of the Guard, Political Principles for Political Action. Now, you have to understand this name, while it may be unfamiliar to you listening, is well known to anybody who's espousing this type of Christian-dominated culture, okay? Quote,
Christians have an obligation, a mandate, a commission, a holy responsibility to reclaim the land for Jesus Christ, to have dominion in civil structures, just as in every other aspect of life and godliness. But it is dominion we are after, not just a voice. Christian politics has at its primary intent the conquest of land, of men, families, institutions, bureaucracies, courts, and governments for the kingdom of Christ.
End quote. But I would say,
as I see it.
Right? Because the reason separation of state happened in this country was because way back in England, there was, before the Glorious Revolution, which was a bloodless coup where they overthrew James II and established a more of a constitutional monarchy. Before that, they had a very bloody war between the Puritans and Charles Cromwell, who ascended the throne, actually just led the country, and then his overthrow by, I think it was Charles II who came back, right? And the Puritans were obsessed with how much Catholicism was still a part of the church. So they need to get rid of it. So they started this war. They became known as Puritans after the war. Guess what the government said? Hey, dudes, if you want to go to somewhere else and live with your crazy fanaticism, we've got boats headed to North America. Take your whole family and go. And they did. Tens of thousands of them left England. And it was, how do we get rid of these folks who instigated a coup, overthrew the country? We just got it back, and we need to get rid of these folks. And so a lot of them came over here. And they're an early group were the Pilgrims. They're not quite the same as the Puritans and the Puritans themselves. But I think you're probably familiar with this part of the story, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what is interesting is to make this really walk and talk, folks have to, within Christian tradition, absolutely ignore the early teachings, the very, very early teachings of the church. They'd have to absolutely ignore all of that it was never about that, because you'd only have to go as far as Jesus is about to get sentenced to death, and he's having a conversation with Pontius Pilate, and they're seeing him as a political uprising. And then he just says to them, actually, if it were about this kingdom, my followers would just come and save me right now, right? Like they would take up a war, and they would do exactly what it sounds like Christian dominionists are trying to do now. But he's like, but they're not going to do that, because my kingdom's not here. Like, it's just bizarre. And not to go down that rabbit hole, but you could even hold up the mirror of their own religious text and say, how does this, it's incongruency at the most ridiculous level.
Yes.
But this is big ass logic, right? They just say, yeah, that's true.
But the opposite is what I'm thinking.
Like,
and it's true too.
But
listen, in New England, where Congregationalism was the official religion, the Puritans exhibited an intolerance of other religious views, including Quakers, Anglicans, Baptists, which is why the Baptists are like, can you get these guys off our back?
Yeah.
By just saying, we're all Christian, we all deserve to be here. That was their angle. Like we're all Christian. Like, and he's like, we
if it's water they like
in England.
If it's water they want, water they get.
Yeah.
Dunk them again, drown them, drown the Baptist, right? I mean, this is what was happening.
This has led now, by absenting ourselves from what John Locke was actually after,
right?
Why the Puritans came here in the first place, what the founders were trying to avoid that had just happened, not even 100 years ago in England. This Christians attacking Christians, the Civil War, it was playing out in the streets in North America. And they did want people to be moral, and everybody was Christian-y, obviously. So they make these references, but they were absolutely clear. No theocracy, not here.
No.
And yet, this is the campaign with rewritten history or whitewashed history by the far right that, everybody from the beginning is trying to make this a Christian culture. So the few of us who believe in this can rule everybody. And it's sort of dystopian to be at this point where this is a real conversation.
Well, in many ways, that whole idea of having dominion over people rules, the rule of law, like this idea that you have to come into an already populated, you just said earlier, let's imagine that there was no one here and it was being discovered, and you air quoted, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
And so what had to happen is, in their minds, if someone's going to have dominion, someone's going to be subjugated, right? So it does require, there is no dominion if everyone just falls in line.
Yeah.
Right? So I do worry about what that means for people who are thinking differently. Is it death or is it imprisonment? What is the 2022-23 version of that? Like, is it just saying to female identified folks that they don't have as many rights? Maybe it's women, reproductive rights. Like, what's up?
I think it's all those things. In fact, they give you a list of all the things that they really care about. So another bit of interesting information, the NRA. Yeah. Okay. You're thinking of which group are you thinking of when I say that?
I'm thinking of guns. No?
Yeah.
Rifle? Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
No. Am I right?
No, I'm thinking of the National Reform Association that was chartered in 1864 following the Civil War because the Confederates, when they put together their Constitution, had God all through it.
Shocking.
Yeah, exactly. Because they needed to justify some pretty horrific things. This group said we should do the same thing. And the NRA has been around since then and keeps pitching Congress on legislation to make the country Christian. A couple of things they've gotten through.
Okay.
In God we trust. That's them.
Right.
That's the Christian rights push. Nobody broadly wanted that. Nobody asked for it. They lobbied like any other group to get any other small group represented. They got the right people at the right time. Boom, that's there. A bunch of other little Christian-y things have all come through the side door. Jefferson would flip in his grave, I think.
Christian-y things? Is that
Christian-y things, like little Christian-y type things that, and that's my background too, just so.
Yeah, okay. I was going to say, let's.
Jarvis is, wow. I wonder what his background is because he's got no, I'm talking as someone from that group who espoused all of these things and didn't know things that were missing on the map. So this is my makeup.
Okay. Or filling in the map, right?
Yeah,
you're filling in the pieces.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So the NRA, they've been pitching these different things. They keep getting sidelined. But now with a number of MAGA folks taking legislative roles, we could see the overthrow of the Founding Fathers' democracy into something more like we see in Iran or Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia, where a small group who believe one way of seeing the world through a religious lens is the way everybody has to live.
So I'm about to do a Google search.
Okay.
So as you were chatting, I looked up those phrases because I was under the impression that there is a deep separation of church and state. And so kind of interested, particularly in the US context, how do you get away with those kind of in God we trust or whatever you called it, Christianisms,
Christian phrases,
yeah.
Christians flavors.
And so I found this term, ceremonial deism. Have you heard of this? This notion that it's okay to have these ritual or ceremonial turns of phrases because they should be interpreted as non-religious and customary usage. So that this is the Supreme Court of the U.S. in 1984.
1984.
1984. Yeah. 1984 plants a flag, probably predicting that this was going to happen as the tide starts to turn to say, look at this phrase. This proves that we're Christian. In 1984, they're saying, wait a second. We should, it's not that we're going to take away the usage of in God we trust or anything like that, but we should just admit that this is non-religious and customary usage. So it reflected phrases of the time and of the day, and they were established, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a Christian country. I mean, I think that's a really important decision by the court that would slow down some of this. Now, the Supreme Court's not always right, I would say, as we just have to look recent decisions in the U.S. But it was a decision in 1984.
Yes. And obviously the In God We Trust one is interesting. And we'll put a link to that too, because it's not as straightforward as you think. Do you know when the phrase was adopted officially?
No.
The 2-cent piece in 1864. Okay. That's where it first showed up. That was from the NRA. Okay. Mm-hmm. But later it was more broadly adopted. And that was what year? Any guess?
The next year. I don't know.
1956. 1956. Right. Do you know why In God We Trust and the Pledge of Allegiance came out in the 50s after World War II under Dwight D. Eisenhower?
Oh, this feels like MAGA.
No. It's a fanatical fear of communism.
Mm-hmm. So let's put it on the money because that's, because really In God We Trust means the dollar. Yeah. And we are capitalists, right? So that's what we're responding against. We're not responding to a sense of moral failing or the fabric of the the nation, the
No,
family
it's a
being
reaction to communism,
right.
pure and simple.
It's a way
It's a
of
political
government,
play. Yep.
and it's a way of business, a way of looking at and protecting the interest of how we're structured and organized.
And we had to play to some very primal, deep held beliefs,
Sure.
all that kind at that time that it became just really interesting, the way the propaganda against communism and whatnot. But it is so unfortunate. The phrase that "in God we trust" replaced, "out of the many, one."
Mm-hmm.
That was an attempt, I think, to say we are all from all over the places of the world, but together here, we are one people. And it's a sort of
like Unitarians.
Yeah, or it kind of became known as melting pot.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if it was always meant to be more mosaic-y, but like
Mm-hmm.
Canada has taken a come here, retain everything, and Canada just represents cultures from around the world, which is kind of what makes it uniquely Canadian. But in the United States, it was more of a melting pot. Either way,
Right.
in God we trust. That was just a bit of propaganda at the time.
I would say that that's probably how folks would like to, or aspirationally, I think that mosaic image is held out to be the way.
Yeah.
But inclusion is hard work. Diversity is easy. And I don't think that we're nailing the how to become inclusive in that that doesn't require people to be a melting pot. Like, how am I being changed and shifting because people are coming is not really the Canadian conversation that it needs to be. It really does require folks to assimilate in some way. And now we just don't know what we're assimilating to.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this comparison between two different countries dealing with similar issues is kind of where I was hoping to go with all of this, because I'm curious to know what you think. There are issues or things that are happening, conflicts or tension points that seem very similar happening all around the world. I mean, if you step back from it, you could look at Russia invading Ukraine to take land, but it's being spoken about in terms of Russia now. Obviously, they're looking for some propaganda leverage. And the one that they've landed on, Nazis didn't work. Okay.
Right.
Satanists, they dragged that out. People didn't really respond to this. The one that's getting traction is the woke left world wants to impose their transgender agenda and LGBTQ agenda on Russia. And we are a Christian country with values, and white Russians need to do what we need to do to keep order in our society and keep things as prosperous as they have been, which was weird to hear from a group of few people.
It's white supremacy, right?
Yeah.
It's white supremacy.
White supremacy. So they throw up Tucker Carlson. Yes.
Oh, there you go.
Sound bites.
This should be great.
He's featured on the show twice a week. They take his recordings. Even in America, Americans know that this wokeness and left liberal agenda from these fascist, tree-hugging, hate the police, people who want to burn the world. We need to stop that. And Americans want to stop it too. And then I don't think it's state media in India, but this woman, she does a pretty decent breakdown. And then she features Putin and Tucker Carlson the same way, from an Indian perspective, to say we have to tramp down this quote unquote inclusive woke agenda. It's overtaking. So in all of these conflicts around the world, it feels like in every country where the normal demarcation is, this is our land, that's your land, we're invading for national reasons of security and whatnot, is devolving into this kind of us and them between the keeps. I want to keep it the way it is. I want to keep our values. I want to keep the power, and I want to keep the structures as they are. And the shares, which are, I want to break everything down. Let's bust it up, share it with everybody. And not all keeps are keeps and not all shares are shares. But it does feel like all of these conflicts around the world, this seems to be at the center. And that feels quite different than World War II, which was very nationalistic driven. Right. Nobody was going to war to fight for their version of a God-ruled country. But that does feel like what's happening in many places around the world today.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about sort of the de-evolution of society.
Yeah,
like we're kind of going back to a very primal reading of people as either helpers or herders. Are you a threat or not? And now I wonder what this is doing to brains as we stop using parts of our brain to do hard work, which is to process new things and to connect with people and expand our experiences. We start to limit our thinking, limit the people around us to be like thinkers, who look like us and talk like us and show up with the same set of values, that I don't have to do any hard work, so that when I need to read someone, my threat cues, when my lizard brain kicks in, I will devolve to do exactly what you do. I have to protect myself. And now, in shutting off that rational part of our brain, we are going to be in really deep trouble, because how do we stop this from sliding to a place where we're seeing it nation to nation, but it can only end in conflict. Like, this is kind of doomed in some
Yeah.
ways, unless we interrupt it with woke thinking, quote unquote.
Right. So Locke knew that, and Locke said, look, let's just keep religion out of this, because this will destroy the democracy. He's watching a war play out based on religious ascendancy. Is it going to be Catholicism? Is it going to be the Protestants? And if it's the Protestants, which of the 50 types of Protestants running around England is it going to be?
Right.
And he wrote this thesis, this brilliant thesis of a democracy absent religious control, which, however, protected religious affiliation. You could belong to whoever you want, believe whatever you want, and the other group cannot walk down the street and hang you on a tree for it. That is no longer reasonable. And this Constitution is going to enshrine that right to believe whatever you want, even if it's not the Christian version that the other person believes. Because it wasn't Christians killing Muslims at the time. It was Baptists and Anabaptists.
This becomes really important in terms of Baptist distinctives, that individual soul liberty, that person's right to, in sort of within that tradition, to think and interpret in their own way. It does seem like it starts to get built into the fabric of some of these other versions of Christian thought. There are some Christian traditions, to be fair, that say, yeah, go ahead, believe that.
Yeah, we
or
do
don't
not
believe
want
that.
to be in power. Yeah, exactly. Like Episcopalians.
We're not trying to amass a whole big group of people, and we're not going out every day to say more and more and more people need to join our church and our way of thinking, because this is a game of numbers.
Yes, exactly. And that is the part that the quest for power and the desire to use the church, the evangelical church. I'm not even going to say far right, but evangelical. Right. Obviously, Trump saw that as an opportunity to get in power, and it's a great way to use these folks to stay in power, which, again, talking about irony, in the minor prophets in the Bible, if anybody reads the Bible on this show, but if you read the minor prophets, which is kind of everything after Isaiah or Ezekiel, these guys did not like the combination of church and state. And they were in a theocracy, for Pete's sake. They were like, anytime that religion becomes a tool for the state, this is not good, folks. Like, don't try and do that.
I wonder if what you're talking about a little bit there, not the minor prophets piece, I'm going back one step, but is a bit of, like, we talk a lot about privilege and various types of privilege. And there is a Christian privilege that can't be ignored. And that is why we're spending so much time talking about a particular tradition, because not all religions have access in the same way to the White House or to policymakers. They don't have that kind of power and flex and privilege. And what we're seeing is everything that we talk about in terms of privilege, we say, when you recognize your privilege, there is a call to allyship. And that's what we're missing right now with some of these groups, is that they're not being good allies. They're doubling down on privilege when recognized and saying, well, of course, it's about time people started recognizing that. Of course we're better. MAGA. I don't know, maybe.
All of this to say that I've just been fascinated. I want to see the funny journey that this country has taken from, we need to protect ourselves from the things that we saw go wrong too. Let's go back to the very things that got us in trouble in the first place back in England, where we needed another country to run away to. And it wasn't only that, by the way. That's the horrible oversimplification. I'm talking mostly about the Puritans.
Slave trade as well.
Yeah,
there's lots of,
exactly. But to see what is happening in the United States being played out, so much so that Russia invokes American dominionism as a basis to justify wiping out another country. If you want to know where it's going to go, that's what it looks like. A small group of people bending the Bible and everything it says to their will so that they can grab as much of what other people have, which is antithetical to Locke's life, liberty, and property, or even Jefferson's pursuit of happiness.
Happiness. Yeah.
Yep, that's where this goes. Christian dominionism only works if there's somebody to rule over with total power. And that is not a future for
It
us.
is not.
Yeah.
No,
No.
it is terrifying, and what it would take to do that. We see that, right? I mean, we have glimpses of that in examples of colonialism. The systems then start to shift to enable that. So we need education systems and
Yep.
and religious systems
Yep.
and political systems and policing systems and courts, all to align and converge on the one mission, which is dominionism. And that will, when we say, oh, that could never happen, we actually don't have to look very far to see examples of where that's been very effective in wiping people out.
Yes, exactly. And the interesting thing about colonialism, unlike when Britain took over India and actually fought with India and had truces and worked with different governments till they finally took over everything through the commercial enterprise of the East Indian Trading Company. When they arrived in North America, they basically just said, there's no one here. Technically, in science, it's known as flexible social cognition, the ability to dehumanize another group based on, like what you were saying, identifiers, right?
Right.
And they just dehumanized them and said, there's nobody here. Columbus wrote that back to the king and queen of Spain.
Right.
There's no one here.
Right.
And those that are here offer no resistance. So it's just ours. We'll take it. And it's that dehumanizing that runs rampant through this current movement where it's like these rules, the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is for all people if you're in our group. Outside of our group, these rules don't apply. And unfortunately, that's where this country began, because it didn't cover all of the enslaved humans in this country driving the economy. It was doomed to fail given that foundation, maybe.
Well, this is uplifting. Gosh, I hope this is posted up right around the Christmas season, just while people are really in a good mood.
Peace and goodwill to all men if you're a man and you look like me and you're white. Otherwise, bye. Okay.
Yeah, kind of.
Let me just end with, so why bother? Because I think these systems and structures are hardwired in our brain. If you see things the other way, that's the only way you can see it based on the way your brain is wired. And you can rationally consider, you can have discussions, but human beings, scientific fact, you need to grow new neural pathways to think differently. And the way you grow new neural pathways is to have experiences. And the experiences that we need to begin to think through this more rationally is with our outgroup, with people who we may not want to share power with, to begin to humanize them or not dehumanize them using your flexible social cognition. Get in relationship. And if you grow new neural pathways, it's really hard to hold to this stuff and still think, but what about Billy and Jenny or whoever, whatever their name is? Because Jake, you have a version of a story, but that's how mine started. I was entrenched squarely in this, in an extreme version of Calvinism even. I've come so far from that, not because of any argument. I can absolutely say it's not because of an argument. It's just because I got to know people and it started to not make sense, because if what I believed wasn't good for everybody, is it good for anybody? And that's the place where I got to, but I only got there through experiences with other people. And so without that, I think this is why we do the work we do. We get people in the community to have these experiences so they think differently. And one by one, human beings can shift and hopefully pass that to the next generation, because this back and forth fight in the media and with people like Tucker Carlson, who's just an entertainer, isn't going to get us anywhere.
You've nailed it. I have a similar story, but I'm thinking back to the very conservative type religious churches that I've grown up and bumped around in, actually cautioned us when we were growing up to not have other thoughts. Don't have friends who aren't Christians.
Yes,
they will. They will take you down this path. To do everything that you just said would happen. They're going to fill your head with different ways of thinking. And you have to be careful of that. Do not let your guard down. You can have friendships so long as you're pulling them in. But you have to walk away when they're pulling you away.
Exactly.
And so the cautions were there to protect the tribe. And I don't criticize them for that. I think it's exactly what happens when you don't have a diverse enough perspective around you. And so people then, they have to read as the other. the folks who were influencing or attempting to influence my childhood, who probably would be really upset by this podcast, to be clear. So they probably won't hear this part. And maybe there are people in my life who won't hear this part. That's not the goal of this, but it's the natural outflow. This podcast represents in a lot of ways what can happen when you start to take a different view of the other and become more inclusive. So
yeah. And I think it's helpful to understand all the different dynamics that came to play that got us to where we are. And when people use these phrases, where'd that phrase come from? Like, is that the NRA phrase that you got from 1956? Like,
right.
It's helpful to know if you're parroting a propagandist and a lobbyist, or if there's any good thinking behind it. And ultimately, how does it resonate with people who aren't like you that you know? Maybe some of your unhoused neighbors.
Right.
How will they feel?
And we've taken, this much time and we've kind of glossed over it, but it hasn't been an easy transition. I think for both of us, we spend a lot of time talking and through. We're kind of shortcutting it, like it's one day you wake up, like this idea of I don't think that happens.
No.
There've been sort of small moves along the way, and the one thing that helps with that journey is to have good relationships that you can bounce things off and talk them through. And so we're doing this on a podcast, but other people may be at different places. So just want to recognize that.
Yeah, it's really good. And some of those folks that you talk to should, if you're like us and you're kind of recovering from your time in that version of the Christian in group, is to talk to people who are still in there. Like I do.
Yes.
Not to get them out, not to convince them or anything, but just, I'm thinking this, how does that land? What do you think? Like, just have that conversation, because people can go to any church, believe whatever you want. It doesn't matter to me. Worship a watermelon. It does not matter. Worship whatever you want. I just come back to the axiomatic truth of, but don't infringe on your neighbor's right to life, the right to liberty, to make the choices they want that are right for them, and the right to happiness or their own property, their body and the things they have, as long as they are not infringing on the rights of others. That is the way we've designed democracy, not this other thing. That's something alien that comes from another place that was never meant to be a part of this great experiment. Hopefully it doesn't take root here.
If democracy is the goal, then it necessitates another. It necessitates that people will think differently. They will have, and there's some organization that sometimes things go your way and sometimes they don't, but we have to kind of figure out how to live within that tension. But this idea of we have to get everyone to think the same, that way we're going to be thriving, it is just terrifying.
And just as we're wrapping up, interestingly, Jefferson, when he was talking to these Baptists, he said, look, the parishioners in your church gave you the authority to tell them what to do. I totally get that. That's fine.
Yeah.
But just because those parishioners gave you authority to tell them what to do doesn't mean that I gave you authority to tell me what to do, or anybody outside. The church has authority over its own, and that is it, period. He was adamant about that, because the only people in a limited government who should have authority are the people that we choose to have authority.
Right.
So in a free and fair election, I should say.
So all you'd have to do is just to go small and look at how some of these groups that are particularly closed organize themselves. Like, why would I trust you with a government system when I know how small churches run? It's terrifying.
That is a good point. That is a good point.
Once you get these right, when you get the 200 people in a small congregation all on the same page, and you're not hurting anyone, and you're vibing in the same direction, and that's like a thriving. Now to scale, show me that you could do it with 20,000. And once you've got 20,000, then maybe. But I know
how about
little
200
pockets.
million?
Yeah. And we'll watch from Canada and say, no, not yet. Okay, waiting.
Get you there. Hey, well, good luck with your new king up there, because that's where the Canadian government gets all its authority. And it was great talking to you.
All right, buddy. Okay.
This has been a Podstarter production.